This video is about how to avoid catastrophic affairs when you're travelling on work trips. I was at a conference once and a friend of mine had a woman who was interested in hooking up with him, and I asked him about it. He was married with 3 kids, and he said, if I can get away with it and no one else gets hurt, why not? It's sex, and if it itches, why not scratch it? This video is about having affairs when travelling, especially for work, and subsequently going to talk about affairs more locally at home, in the workplace where you live. But the aim is to help you, if you're a dad and you do wish to avoid catastrophic affairs that break up families. And the overall goal is to avoid putting your children's emotional health at risk. And these 5 risks are risks that I will promise to quickly discuss at the end of the video. You may be surprised to know, what percentage of married men do you think have affairs on trips? That is, they cheat on their partners while on a business trip. Well, published data indicate that up to 36% of men report doing this. And look, I've been on hundreds of work trips to 43 different countries, and I'm very aware of this issue and its consequences for dads. And we've discussed it various times amongst each other. And an important additional point, 13% of women on business trips who are married also have affairs, 13%. So what we say in this video also applies to women. And let me be clear up front, I am not moralizing or judging. This discussion, in fact the whole channel, is primarily about the future well-being of our kids. We're just providing advice here to those parents who are keen to avoid putting their kids at risk by getting caught out and having an affair that damages the family and hurts those kids. We're not otherwise moralizing. I need to make that clear. And as I said, this first video is focused on affairs on the road, as it were, when travelling for work, and later we'll talk about other sorts of affairs. But anyway, please subscribe so that you get notified of those subsequent videos. Now let's face the facts with some honesty. If Dad does have an affair, there is about a 50% risk that it'll end up in divorce and create difficulties with the kids. So before we discuss these 4 tips, I strongly encourage those who are watching, men and women, to never say, hey, it could never happen to me. Friends of mine have described how that was the attitude that they took, and it was just that attitude that got them caught out because they didn't plan and think about it in advance, and it led ultimately to their divorce. So I think it's better to always assume that you are vulnerable, otherwise your overconfidence might catch you out. And look, if you're in the 64% for whom this is not an issue when you travel for work, please pass on your wisdom through the comments section below. Now, these 4 brilliant strategies to avoid catastrophic affairs come from a group of senior leaders who travel a lot, and who, when we all got together to discuss this issue openly, uncannily, we all came up with the same 4 tips. And it turns out that's exactly what the professional bodies and psychologists say as well. So it's pretty powerful. Tip number 1, avoid risky situations. In other words, for example, be aware of being one-on-one with women for long periods. And especially don't be alone with a woman if there's been a lot of alcohol involved. This is a hugely, and maybe the most hugely vulnerable time. I'm very aware of that myself. And I'm very careful, and it can be especially a problem also if there's a major differential in fame, power, or sometimes money. Please don't take advantage of that. And please don't flirt with the ladies just because it feeds your ego and makes you feel masculine or sexy. I've watched that in action often, and I can't help but admit that it looks cheap and childish to me. But I do feel bad saying that because I'm being judgmental, and I'm sure I used to do that too, particularly when I was young at times. But it is hollow and selfish. Rule number 2, avoid excessive emotional intimacy. If someone is starting to look interested, always talk about your wife using positive words, and talk about the kids. And avoid oversharing, which can lead to emotional affairs. And phrases like, my wife doesn't understand me. And if you're a kind, empathic person, this is a big risk, and you can sense it. But really, it's also an opportunity to be genuinely kind and compassionate without looking like you're trying to get her into bed. And talk warmly about your wife and kids, as I mentioned. So when someone asks an attractive woman if anyone really cared about her on her trips and showed her genuine interest as a person and wasn't trying to get her into bed, any man, be the exception that she mentions. He was genuinely kind and respectful, but never crossed a line. Always affirmed his own family. There was something deep and rich and trustworthy about him that I rarely see in other men. Tip number 3 is to share a room with colleagues, although only, of course, if they are supportive colleagues and not sort of out on the hunt themselves. One person has told me that but for this strategy of sharing a room, he could well have ended up in bed with an attractive colleague with whom there were strong emotional feelings plus alcohol, but he had nowhere to take her. He was saved by this rule, by the presence and the accountability of his friends, and was grateful. Tip number 4 is actually a beautiful thing. It's to nurture your marriage before leaving. In its simplest form, it sounds silly, but it works, is to include talking to the spouse about these strategies. I told Jackie, and I thought it might be a nice act of love to tell her how intentional I was, and she said, "You don't need to, I trust you." But I wanted to. But I later overheard her passing on that wisdom to another young dad who travelled. We'll talk more about nurturing your relationship in a later video or two, but one simple strategy that many couples agreed to was to make sure, it sounds simple really, make sure they had sex before their partner left for the trip. And I used to joke and say that like we always had sex before I went on a trip, and I'd say to that, at least if the wings fell off the plane after it took off and it was heading for the ground, at least I'd go down with a smile on my face. One wife who was aware of the value of this strategy said that if the wife doesn't actually feel like it precisely at the time the husband's about to go on a trip, she should go ahead anyway, with an attitude of gratitude, enjoying the fact and the reality that this person loves me. He loves me and wants to be safe. It's a beautiful thing. Christians sign up at the altar to not just stay faithful, but to love and to cherish. And those are beautiful words. Love is patient and kind, and it's full of grace. It's about giving. If we nurture our closest relationship, we are way less likely to be vulnerable to physical or emotional affairs. Now, dads, you will be tempted, but remember then, and be aware that human survival biology creates an inbuilt deceptive survival drive. Attraction and sex are disproportionately powerful urges at the front end, but they can generate enormous regrets, of course, at the back end. You must have experienced that. But it can make men think that an affair might just not be all that bad at the moment of decision, and maybe they can get away with it. But it's afterwards that regrets flood in. So again, I strongly encourage you to decide on these strategies in advance for your work travel. Now, I promise to finish by quickly reminding you of the well-published negative risks of affairs on the mental well-being of your children. Here are the top 5. The first is anger. Up to 90% of children feel angry, and some get aggressive toward the cheating parent. And in some cases, I know that anger has resulted in that child not speaking to the parent again for years, and sometimes forever. The second risk, psychological withdrawal and anxiety and depression. The third risk is loss of concentration at school, impacting their academic performance. The fourth risk is that they themselves struggle with forming trusting, healthy romantic relationships compared to other people because they've experienced the effects of lack of trust. And finally, number 5, they are more subject to risky behaviours such as substance abuse or early sexual activity as a coping mechanism or reaction to the stress that it's caused. So dads, please pass on these tips to other dads who travel, no matter how old they are. And thanks for listening.